أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, we will begin with a study of one of the most important books on Islamic law, and that is a book called Sharai Al-Islam, authored by the great Muhaqiq Al-Hilli. Now, typically this text is taught in the Hausa, and it's taught either in Arabic or in Farsi. However, what I'll do is that I'll try to go through this text and offer an English commentary on this text. However, before we begin by examining the book itself, I thought it would be beneficial to give a very brief a brief overview of the historical development of Islamic law, of Ilm al-Fiqh. Now, my dear brothers and sisters, as many of you know, during the lifetime of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muslims would learn the ahkam, they would learn the Islamic laws directly from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In fact, the Prophet he used to say to his companions, "Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli." The Prophet would say to those who were around him, "Pray as you see me pray." Learn the rulings of the prayer from me. Examine and observe how I pray and emulate me. When the Prophet ﷺ would go for Hajj, he would say to his companions, "Khudhu minni manasikakum," that take from me, learn from me the rites and the rituals of Hajj. And therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, after the Holy Quran, the Prophet ﷺ is the main source of Islamic law. People would ask him about what is permissible and what is forbidden, what is recommended and what is discouraged. And they would inquire about major issues, minor issues, how they should distribute their inheritance. They would ask him about the laws pertaining to menstruation and so on and so forth. What is permissible for them to eat? What are they allowed to wear? What transactions are permissible? What transactions are forbidden? And the Prophet ﷺ, he would answer these questions, and there was no ambiguity. The people could directly ask the Prophet. And this is what the Quran had instructed the Muslims. When you look at the Holy Quran in Surah Al-Hashr, verse 7, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explicitly says to the believers that whatever the Prophet gives you, whatever he presents to you, you can take it, because the Prophet is a legislator of the sacred law. Now, after the death of the Prophet, those who adhered to the dictates of Hadith al-Thaqalain, they took their ahkam from Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib. Of course, the Prophet, he lived for a finite period of time in this world, and there were many issues that came up after the death of the Prophet. And the Prophet, we did not have any ahadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So after the death of the Prophet, those who obeyed the Prophet in terms of following the Book of Allah and his Ahlul Bayt, they took their ahkam, they took the Islamic laws from Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, because he was the continuation of the Sunnah of the Prophet. Now, one may ask, what is the definition of Sunnah? When we say that the sources of our teachings are the Quran and the Sunnah, we have to understand the definition of the Sunnah. And therefore, we can define the Sunnah as follows. The Sunnah basically refers to قول المعصوم أو فعل المعصوم أو تقرير المعصوم. The Sunnah refers to the words of the infallible the actions of the infallible, or the tacit approval of the infallible. Now, when it comes to qawlul ma'soom, the words, the verbal utterances of the infallible, when we look at the statements of the Prophet or the statements of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, from their statements, we understand that, for example, they say that, pork is prohibited, that this particular transaction is permissible. So we can understand what is halal, what is wajib, what is haram, what is makruh, what is mustahab, what is mubah from the words of the infallibles. Now, there are some ahkam that we understand not because the Imams uttered anything related to that issue, but we observe the action of the ma'soom. So, for example, when the Prophet ﷺ, when he went for Hajj, he performed tawaf around the Kaaba while he was mounted on his camel. Now, from this action, from the amal, from the fi'l of the Prophet, we understand that it is permissible for a pilgrim, for a person who's performing Hajj, to perform tawaf around the Kaaba while they are mounted on an animal. So from the action of the Prophet, we can deduce the following ruling, that it is permissible for someone to do tawaf around the Kaaba while they are mounted. Now, the Prophet never said that it is permissible for you to do tawaf while you're on an animal or while you are mounted. The Prophet, he never uttered such a statement. But we understand that it's permissible because the Prophet did it. If it was forbidden, the Prophet ﷺ would never engage in any action that's prohibited or in any action that would nullify the validity of the tawaf. So the sunnah represents the words of the infallible, the actions of the infallible, and taqreerul ma'soom. Sometimes we can derive and we can deduce rulings when certain actions are performed by someone else in the presence of the ma'soom, and the ma'soom does not object to that action. So an example that we can give is, imagine, for instance, that Zurara ibn A'yan, one of the noble companions of Imam al-Baqir, Imam al-Sadiq, let's say that Zurara, he performs wudu in front of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. Let's say that we have such a report. And let's say that Zurara, when he came to wiping his head during the wudu, he wiped, instead of from the top of his head downward, he wiped mankusan. He wiped from the hairline back. If we have a report that says that Zurara did mash mankusan, if he wiped in the other direction, upward, in the presence of Imam al-Baqir, and Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam did not object, we can infer, we can deduce from this report that it is permissible to wipe your head while you're doing wudu from the hairline backwards. Instead of wiping like this, you can wipe like this, mankusan. Because Imam al-Baqir did not object, this tacit approval indicates that it is permissible to wipe in that manner. So therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, we can derive many ahkam from the words of the ma'soom, but not only the words, from their actions as well as their tacit approval. Now, during the lives of the A'imma alayhimus salam, their companions, they used to go to them. They would ask them questions and the Imams would respond to them directly. Now, because of the atmosphere of taqiyya during the time of Imam al-Hussein and Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, the Shi'as really did not have that much of an opportunity to take knowledge from the Imams. The Imams were not able to hold public classes until the time of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhimus salam. During their period, because that period marked the decline of the Umayyads and the rise of the Abbasids, there was a period of freedom and flexibility. And people used to flock to Medina to learn their deen from Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. And these two Imams, the fifth and the sixth Imam, they emphasize the importance of their companions and their students writing down the ahadith. For example, we have Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam saying to his companions, احتفظوا بكتبكم, that preserve and hold on to these books that you have in which you're writing our ahadith. فإنكم سوف تحتاجون إليها, because soon you will be in need. You will need these books. In another tradition, Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says to Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar, he says to him, اكتب وبث علمك في إخوانك. Write down what you hear from me and disseminate this knowledge among your brethren. فإن مت, if you die, فأورث كتبك بنيك. If you die, make sure that you write in your will that your children are to inherit these books, these collections of written hadith that you took from us, the Ahlul Bayt. فإنه يأتي على الناس زمان هرج, because there will be a period of confusion. لا يأنسون فيه إلا بكتبهم. There will come a time where you will have no way of drawing the knowledge of the Ahlul Bayt except from these books. It's as though Imam is foreshadowing that in the future you will not have easy access to the later Imams. So make sure that you write and you preserve this knowledge. Now, even if you look at the books of Rijal, if you look at the books of Al-Najashi, Rijal al-Najashi, if you look at Al-Fihrist by Sheikh Al-Tusi, you'll find the names of the companions of the various Imams. And Sheikh Al-Najashi and Sheikh Al-Tusi, they would often comment that, this particular companion had a book. They recorded notes from the Imams oftentimes at the request of the Imams. So we have many companions who actually had books that they wrote, and by books we mean that they had written records of the ahadith that they heard from the Imams. So for example, Zurara ibn A'yan, he had books, he had collections of written hadith that he heard from the Imams. Muhammad ibn Muslim, he had kutub. Muhammad ibn Abi Umair, he had books, written records of the ahadith. Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman, and so on and so forth. Now, some of these books that were written during the times of the Imams, they actually still exist today. So for instance, we have Kitab al-Mahasin by Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Khalid al-Barqi, who died in 274 after the Hijrah. This was during the era of the Imams. And this book, Kitab al-Mahasin, was one of the main sources for Sheikh al-Kulayni when he was compiling Al-Kafi. And it was also one of the main sources of Sheikh al-Saduq in his Man La Yahduruhu al-Faqih. The father of al-Barqi was also a student. So Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Khalid al-Barqi, he was a contemporary of Imam al-Jawad and Imam al-Hadi. His father was a contemporary of Imam al-Kadhim and Imam al-Ridha and Imam al-Jawad. So this period was the period of the Imams. And luckily, we still have this book with us today. Another example of a book that was written during the time of the Imams that still exists today is Qurb al-Isnad by Abdullah ibn Ja'far al-Himyari, who died in 353 after the Hijrah. So this was close to the time of the Imams. And then you have Masail Ali ibn Ja'far. Masail Ali ibn Ja'far. Ali ibn Ja'far was the son of Imam al-Sadiq. He was the brother of Imam al-Kadhim. And he wrote down many ahadith from his brother Imam Musa ibn Ja'far. And there were hundreds of these books that were composed and they were authored. Now, of these hundreds upon hundreds of books, there were 400 of them that were preserved, and these sources were relied upon by Shia ulama. And these 400, out of the tens of hundreds, perhaps, there were 400 that were relied upon, and they were considered the usul. The usul. So these 400 usul. So, for example, you have Zurara had an asl, Hariz, for example, had an asl. There were 400 of them, and these 400 usul, they basically what gives them distinction. Of course, kutub. There's a difference between a kitab and an asl. There might be a companion who had a kitab, but for a companion to have an asl, it means that that collection was relied upon by Shia ulama. Now, these 400 usul, they formed the basis of Ahlul Bayt's hadith. For example, we have a statement from Imam As-Sadiq, salawatullahi alayhi, where he speaks about the great contribution of these companions who wrote down these ahadith directly from the Imams. Imam As-Sadiq, for instance, he says, Rahimallahu Zurara ibn A'yan. May Allah have mercy upon Zurara, the son of A'yan. He says, Lawla Zurara wa nudhara'u. If it wasn't for Zurara and the likes of Zurara, landarasat ahadithu abi. He says the ahadith of my father, Imam al-Baqir, would have been lost. It was Zurara who preserved these ahadith because of how diligent he was in writing them from Imam al-Baqir. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says in another tradition, Ma ajidu ahadan ahya dhikrana wa ahadith abi. I have not seen anyone from among my companions, from among the Shia, who have revived our teachings and who have revived and preserved the narrations and the traditions of my father, illa Zurara, except for Zurara, wa Abu Basir, Layth al-Muradi, and Muhammad ibn Muslim, and Burayd ibn Muawiyah. And the Imam then says, وَلَوْلَا هَؤُلَاء مَا كَانَ أَحَدٌ يَسْتَنْبِطُ هَذَا. If it wasn't for these individuals, no one would have been able to derive the laws of Islam. And then the Imam says, هَؤُلَاء حُفَّاظُ الدِّينِ. These individuals are the ones who preserved the religion. وَأُمَنَاءُ أَبِي. And they are the trustees of my father, Imam al-Baqir. وَأُمَنَاءُ أَبِي عَلَى حَلَالِ اللَّهِ وَحَرَامِهِ. They are the trustees in terms of preserving what is permissible and what is forbidden in Islam. You take, for example, Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr, and just to give you a sense as to how much they endured to preserve this intellectual legacy of the Ahlul Bayt. The tyrants of the time, the governments, they used to apprehend and arrest the companions of the Imams. Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr was one of them. They captured him and they whipped him 1,000 times just so he could give up the names of the Shi'as who would come to him and ask him questions about what Imam al-Baqir said and what Imam al-Sadiq said. And he withstood, he endured that abuse to preserve the safety of the Shia. And then came the period of al-Ghaybatu al-Sughra, where the Shias lost direct contact with their Imams. And this is where the period of writing ahadith directly from the Imams ended. In fact, if you look at Al-Ghaybatu al-Sughra, there were only a few laws that were given to the Shia through the Nuwab. For example, Al-Allam al-Majlisi, he mentions about 20 to 25 narrations in Bihar al-Anwar where the Nuwab would basically communicate certain legal rulings to the Shia. So they're a very small number. Most of the ahkam, most of the Islamic laws that we have come from Imam al-Sadiq and Imam al-Baqir, and of course their knowledge is coming from their grandfather, the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then we have Sheikh al-Kulayni. Sheikh al-Kulayni took it upon himself to organize these 400 usul. So as we mentioned, these usul were basically written records of ahadith that companions had gathered from the Imam. So one companion would sit with Imam al-Sadiq and they would have a question, for example, about the tafsir of a particular verse. They'd ask a question about inheritance. They'd ask another question about halal and haram food. So you have these sort of miscellaneous collections of ahadith. Now, so each asl, could essentially be a collection of legal traditions, theological traditions, ethical traditions, and so on. So Sheikh al-Kulayni, he gathered these usul, and he spent 20 years going through them and organizing them according to topic. And he produced his famous work, his magnum opus, Kitab al-Kafi, which is 8 volumes. The first 2 volumes are Usul al-Kafi, and that's where he collected all of the ahadith that deal with, theological matters. Then you have Furu' al-Kafi, and the last volume is Rawdatul Kafi. So Furu' al-Kafi is essentially 5 volumes, and it's basically all of the rulings related to Tahara all the way to Diyat. And then the final volume of Al-Kafi is Rawdatul Kafi, which is essentially a collection of miscellaneous traditions, some of the sermons and letters and stories related to the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Now, this is when we see the science of fiqh coming to life. So essentially, ilm al-fiqh was born after the production of this work. Now, during this time, you have 2 prominent Shia jurists who emerge. The first of them is the famous Ibn al-Junayd, whose full name is Abu Ali ibn Ahmad ibn al-Junayd al-Katib al-Iskafi. He was the teacher. He was one of the teachers of Sheikh al-Mufid. And we have another scholar who emerges at this time, who died in 329 after the Hijrah, Abu Muhammad Hassan ibn Ali al-Hadda al-Umani. So Ibn al-Junayd and Ibn Abi Aqil are both called al-Qadimain, the 2 ancient Shi'i jurists. And then after some time, another great Shi'i scholar emerged by the name of Sheikh al-Muhaddithin, Sheikh al-Saduq, rahmatullahi alayh, who died in 381 after the Hijrah. His father was also a prominent scholar by the name of Sheikh Ali ibn Babawayh al-Qummi, and it is said that he sent a message to the 12th Imam via one of his deputies, and he actually asked Imam Sahib al-Zaman to pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants him a son, and it is said that Sheikh al-Saduq was the answer to that dua. Now, Sheikh al-Saduq did not satisfy himself with the contribution of Sheikh al-Kulayni in terms of al-Kafi. He collected the usul, and he collected other books of hadith that he relied upon, and he collected his own hadith collection, which focuses on legal matters, and his book was Man La Yahdaruhu al-Faqih. Now, Sheikh al-Saduq also authored many books, and he was an expert in, categorizing the ahadith that we have from the Ahlul Bayt. For instance, we have a book in which Sheikh al-Saduq gathered all of the ahadith that he could find on the 12th Imam, and he wrote a book called Kamaluddin wa Tamamun Ni'mah. Again, this book focuses on the traditions that relate to the 12th Imam, the prophecies relating to the Imam, his occultation, and his reappearance. He also wrote another book called Al-Khisan, which literally means characteristics or qualities. And it's a book of hadith, and the chapters are based on numbers. So, for example, he'll have chapter 1, and he'll mention all of the ahadith that speak about, have ahadith that mention a particular quality or merit. And then he'll have chapter 2, which mention 2 khisal. Among the most forgotten blessings are 2. The blessing of health and the blessing of free time. So health and wealth. So the point is, he'll mention various ahadith based on these numbers. He also collected, he has another book called Thawabul A'mal wa Iqabul A'mal, the reward for actions and the punishment for actions. So he collects all of the ahadith that mention specific rewards for good deeds and the punishments that are mentioned for specific sins. He also has a hadith collection known as Uyun Akhbar al-Ridha. Again, some have questions about this book being attributed to Imam al-Ridha, but many scholars believe that these ahadith are hadith collections that Sheikh al-Saduq organized, and they basically represent ahadith and traditions from the 8th Imam of Ahlul Bayt. Sheikh al-Saduq also has another book by the name of At-Tawheed. He collected the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt that speak about the existence of God, the attributes of God, the oneness of God, of Qada and Qadar, all these matters that relate to our understanding and our conception of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Sheikh al-Saduq's magnum opus was a book called Madinatul Ilm, but unfortunately, this precious work was lost, and it's very likely that it was lost when Sheikh al-Tusi's library was burned. Now, after Sheikh al-Tusi, after Sheikh al-Saduq, we have the famous Sheikh al-Mufid, who died in 413 after the Hijrah. He was probably the most prominent student of Sheikh al-Saduq. And then after Sheikh al-Mufid, you have Sheikh al-Tusi, Sheikh al-Ta'ifa, who was the leader of the Shia world in terms of his scholarship. Sheikh al-Tusi wrote many books. In fact, one could even say that he was a polymath. You know, among the books that he wrote were two of the 4 canonical hadith collections in the Shia tradition. He wrote At-Tahdhib, which was basically a commentary on Sheikh al-Saduq's Al-Muqni'a, and he wrote Al-Istibsar, which is a hadith collection where Sheikh al-Tusi essentially reconciles between ahadith that seem to contradict. So he addresses the apparent discrepancies that we have in our sources. So these 4 books, Al-Kafi, Man La Yahdaruhu Al-Faqih, Al-Tahdhib, and Al-Istibsar, these are known as Al-Kutub Al-Arba'a. And half of them, 2 of the 4, are authored by Sheikh al-Tusi. Now, what makes these hadith collections unique is that Sheikh al-Saduq and Sheikh al-Kulayni and Sheikh al-Tusi, they mention their chains of transmission. Generally, they mention their chains of transmission going back to the infallibles. Sheikh al-Tusi died in 460 after the Hijrah. Now, it's important to note here that whenever we speak about Sheikh al-Tusi or any scholars that came before Sheikh al-Tusi, they are referred to collectively as al-Qudama. So when we refer to the legal opinions of the Qudama, the ancient jurists, we're basically referring to Sheikh al-Tusi and any jurist that came before the year 460 after the Hijrah. Now, because Sheikh al-Tusi was such a towering figure, for about 100 years after Sheikh al-Tusi, no one dared to challenge the legal opinions of Sheikh al-Tusi until about 100 years ago, until about 100 years after Sheikh al-Tusi. Within about half a century to a century after Sheikh al-Tusi, you have a Shi'i scholar emerging in the city of Hilla by the name of Ibn Idris Al-Hilli, who died in 598 after the Hijrah. He was the first jurist and scholar to challenge some of the legal opinions of Sheikh al-Tusi. So he broke that stagnation and that reliance on Sheikh al-Tusi, and he revived the spirit of ijtihad among the Shia scholars. Now, Sheikh al-Tusi, Sheikh al-Mufid, Sayyid al-Murtada, they were all based in Baghdad. The center of learning was based in Baghdad for a long time. Of course, for a period, Sheikh al-Tusi relocated to Najaf. Now, because of the emergence of scholars like Ibn Idris Al-Hilli and Muhaqiq Al-Hilli, who is the author of the work that we're going to be examining, and Allam Al-Hilli, the center for Islamic learning moved from Baghdad to Hilla. So Hilla essentially became the epicenter for Shia scholarship, and it remained there for almost 300 years. Now, going back to Ibn Idris al-Hilli, one of the most important books, if not the most important book that he published, was Kitab al-Sara'ir, which was his work on Islamic law. Now we fast forward, again, I don't want to go into too much detail here. We fast forward to the the era of the Akhbaris, who were based in Karbala. And this was a group that emerged within the Shias. They are Shias, but they had their own methodology. They, for example, did not believe that we could go by the apparent meaning of the Holy Quran. Basically, and of course, the Akhbaris exist on a spectrum. Some of them would argue that we cannot comment on the meaning of any verse in the Quran without referring to the Ahlul Bayt. In fact, they would argue that the zawahir of the Quran are not hujjah. Even a verse like Qul huwa Allahu ahad, we will not understand it unless we turn to the guidance of the Ahlul Bayt. So for a period, the Akhbari movement was strong in Karbala until the great Al-Wahid Al-Bahbahani, who died in 1205 after the Hijrah. He basically countered and refuted the Akhbari ideology, and he established the Usuli school. And then you have great scholars who come after Al-Wahid Al-Bahbahani, the likes of Sheikh Ja'far Kashif Al-Ghita, until we reach Sheikh Al-A'zam, the great Sheikh Al-Ansari. And then after him, you have Al-Mujaddid Al-Shirazi, who basically relocated to Samarra and established the seminary in Samarra. And then after him, you have Al-Akhund Al-Khurasani, the author of Al-Kifaya, whose book on Islamic legal theory is still taught until today. And in fact, many scholars in the Hawza, they consider it to be the most important book ever written on Usul al-Fiqh. And then after Al-Akhund Al-Khurasani, again, I'm jumping a little bit, just mentioning some of the most prominent scholars. There are other prominent ulama who I have not mentioned. I just want to give you just a quick overview, some of the important names to keep in mind. After Al-Akhund Al-Khurasani, for example, among the most popular jurists in the 12 Shi'i tradition is Sayyid Kadhim Al-Yazdi, who is the author of Al-Urwatul Wuthqa, which is a very important collection of a collection on Islamic law. I think perhaps all of the maraji' today, they follow the template that Sahib al-Urwa devised. And in fact, one of the ways in which our scholars demonstrate their juristic prowess is that they comment and they write annotations and commentaries on Sayyid Kadhim al-Yazdi's work. And then after Sayyid Kadhim al-Yazdi, you have Sayyid Abu al-Hasan al-Isfahani, and then after him, you have Sayyid Muhsin al-Hakim, and then after him, you have Sayyid al-Khu'i, and then, of course, the most famous student of Sayyid al-Khu'i is perhaps Sayyid al-Sistani. And that just gives you kind of an overview of, how it all began with the Prophet and where we are today in terms of Islamic law. Now, as I said, the book that we're going to be covering is Sharai al-Islam by Al-Muhaqiq Al-Hilli. So he's one of the great scholars who hails from the city of Hilla. He died in 676 after the Hijrah, and he is arguably one of the most prolific fuqaha of the Shi'i tradition. His book Sharai' is said to contain over 12,000 ahkam, 12,000 rulings. Just to give you a sense as to how important this book is and what a seminal work it is in our tradition, for over 750 years, this book has been taught in the Islamic seminaries around the world, from Qom to Najaf and beyond. Over 100 shuruhat, over 100 commentaries have been written on Sharai', and inshallah, we'll try to cover at least some sections of Sharai'. In the Hawza, we typically don't go through the entire book. We go through some sections of the book, some of the kutub, just to give students some familiarity with the language of some of these older fuqaha, and to expose you to some of the discussions that some of our jurists have had. And there's a little bit of istidlal, a little bit of juristic reasoning that we can mention as we go through this book. So inshallah, in our next session, we'll try to delve into Kitab al-Tahara, which is the book of purification. It's the first section of this book. And I'll go over the structure of this book and some of the unique qualities and features of this book in our next session, inshallah. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.